Welcome, everybody. This is as Polly said, as part of a group of webinars that I've given on aquatic plant identification. Now, one of the problems with aquatic plants is that although a few of them have nice showy flowers, there are an awful lot that just have rather nondescript flowers, which are not terribly useful for identification. So the best approach for when looking at aquatic plants is to divide them up into leaf form types to use vegetative characters. And that, if you can put them in the right group, that reduces the possibilities to a much smaller number of species. And it's a good way of accessing into them, because a lot of the families involved in aquatic plants are families of their own. They're not related to the terrestrial groups. So as I was saying, this is part of a group of webinars, and I've been tackling each of the leaf form groups in separate webinars. But today I'm wanting to talk about floating leaf species, which is one of the larger groups. So we've actually divided this into two parts. Floating leaf species are ones that sit on the surface of the water and have opaque leaves, unlike some of the underwater leaved ones, which are more translucent. These have a proper cuticle, and they sit on the surface of the water. And I've divided them into two groups, so it's not, and we'll have a break between the two. And the first, I'll be tackling the medium to large species, things like water lilies and frogbit and the like. And in the second part, I will tackle the smaller ones, which are particularly the duckweeds. I just wanted to divert off, since the previous webinars I've given, there are two very good books that have come out, which are well worth knowing about. The first is Aquatic Plants of Northern and Central Europe. It's quite a mighty tome, but it's very good, because one of the problems has always been that aquatic plants are well distributed through books, because they're all different families, and putting them all together has always been a problem. But this has a lot of detail. It tells you what you might confuse things with, and also, which is quite important, it tells you when to stop and say you can't go any further, because that's always a problem, that some guides take you further than you should, when, for example, you don't have the right parts to identify it. You've just got to stop and say this is a water crowfoot or whatever it is. The other one is a nice illustrated guide produced by Joe Caffrey and two of his colleagues, and it covers Irish plants, but it's just as good. There are a lot of most of the species are the same as they are in Britain, and lots of color pictures, and this one actually includes a little bit more of the sort of wetland edge species than the previous one is more specifically to just the plants actually in the water. As before, there are on the Aquatic Plants Project website a number of keys that I've produced over the years. They're designed to fit onto an A4 so that you can laminate them and take them out in the field. and the various other useful things you'll find on the Aquatic Plants Project website. And as before, there are a number of books produced by the Botanical Society of British and Ireland, which are extremely useful for aquatic plants. There are several handbooks, although none of those will be deal with any of the floating leaf plants. But the plant crib, which is now over 25 years old now, but it's still extremely useful, and it takes some of the more difficult groups and goes into them in more detail than can be covered in the normal plant identification guides. And also a good useful book is Richard Lansdowne's Guide to River Plants, which covers a lot of lake species as well, because there is a lot of overlap. But to get back to the subject of today's, so the first part, we're going to be looking at the medium to large floating species, and these are the groups. These are the genera and species that I'm going to cover in this first part. The two in orange, I won't go into a lot of detail because there are other webinars that I've done which cover those in much greater detail. But I will just sort of bring them into the conversation as we go past them. I'm not going to cover today. There are a group of ribbon leaf plants which come up to the surface and have linear leaves, sort of long linear leaves, which come in the strappy group, and those will be the subject of another webinar. Also, I won't be covering. There are a number of feathery leaf things that sit on or above the surface. With these are leaves, species with the leaves that are very divided, such as the parrot's feather, for example, which is a very feathery leaf. But I will cover combinations where one of the leaf forms is a floating leaf. So things like the water crowfoots have two types of leaves. They have underwater leaves, which are quite, you can see here, are quite sort of divided and feather-like, but it also very often produces floating leaves. Now, the main characters that are really useful for identifying these floating leaf plants are the size. There are some, they vary quite considerably, but largest being the water lilies, and there are all sorts of smaller sized ones. The way the leaves are lobed or not lobed is important. And the venation of the leaf is also a very useful character. These three characters will really, you'll see, will come up again and again. These floating leaved ones really fit into three groups. Here we've got leaves which are sort of divided or lobed in a sort of palmate way, like sort of radiating out, and includes particularly the water crowfoots. There are another group where there's the leaves are basically round or oval, but they have a gap in the bottom and two lobes of the leaves sticking out backwards. And the gap between is often referred to as a sinus. I'll probably mention that as we go along. And there's a third group where the leaves are completely oval or round, and have a rounded base. And and includes things like the common pondweed and right. So if we tackle the first group, the ones where the leaves are palmately-lobed, they're essentially just a small group here. There's the water crowfoots, and as I said before, that I've dealt with those in another webinar, so I won't go into a lot of detail there. But you can see that it has a leaf which is quite sort of divided with sort of scallops around the edge. And there's another buttercup which also produces floating leaves, and I think called floating pennywort. So the water crowfoots, they have generally quite smallish leaves, up to about 4 centimeters. The width of this split, it becomes relevant with one of the ones I'm coming to in a moment. But you'll see that there tends to be quite a sort of wide gap between the lowest lobes of the leaves. And often they're in combination with underwater leaves, which are divided in a sort of tuning fork divisions into sort of lots of capillary segments. As I say, the other one, the other buttercup in this group is the celery-leaved buttercup, which is a yellow flowering one, so it doesn't count as a water crowfoot. But it does produce leaves which do look quite similar to the water crowfoots when they're sort of just sitting on the water surface, as you can see all along the side here. But they differ, whereas the previous ones, they're all sort of horizontal and they sort of root at the nodes. The celery-leaved one tends to form quite a sort of rosette, and will have stems that will come out the top here as an erect plant. And again, as in the water crowfoots, you can see that there's quite a wide gap at the base between the lowest lobes. And the third one in this group is a rather nasty, aggressive introduced species called floating pennywort. It has, again, a sort of lobe leaf with an incision in the bottom, a basal sinus. But you'll notice here the two lobes almost meet on either side. There isn't that wide gap between the lowest lobes. And usually it will also be in very large quantity because it spreads very rapidly out across the water surface. So instead of the previous one where we got quite a similar looking leaf, but just forms individual rosettes and a sort of vertical flowering stem when it's flowering. In the floating pennywort, there will be usually large masses of the plant spread out over the water surface. Just for comparison, this is the common native marsh pennywort. Doesn't have a basal split and the leaf stalk comes right up into the middle of the leaf with a sort of round leaf around it. And the indentations around the leaf are much shallower. So if we move on to the second group, these are the ones which are unlobed. So they're basically just an oval leaf with the leaf stalk coming in on one side. And again, it's quite a small group. and we'll go through these again one by one. The first thing to look at with these ones is the leaf venation, which is a very useful character. And the choice is between the sort of typical dicot venation, which is a herringbone structure, or the monocots, which have lots of parallel veins, but it does have cross veins, but those tend to be much lesser, and the main veins are running more or less parallel up the leaf. And if we go for the ones with the herringbone pattern, basically the main species is Amphibious Bistort, which, when it's flowering, of course, it's easy. It's got these very obvious pink flowers, but it differs from most of the other species by this herringbone venation, and so it's quite easy to separate even when the flowers aren't present. One thing that's worth noticing is that the base of the leaf, the leaf stalk, has a sheathing part. It has its own jargon term. It's called an ochrea, but it means that instead of the leaf coming straight into the node, there is this sort of sheathing base to the leaf wrapped around the stem. That's significant when coming to the next thing, which is the water primroses, because they don't have that sheathing. The leaf just comes straight into the node. Now, water primrose is another introduction. We'll be discussing, unfortunately, quite a few introduced species in this talk today. This one has very pretty flowers. They look like small evening primroses, but particularly in continental Europe, it is really quite a serious pest, and takes over large areas of water bodies. So far, I mean, there have been a few appearances in Britain, and I think possibly Ireland too. But for the most part, they've been sort of tackled before they've started taking over. So, but it is something that may, particularly with global warming, may appear more and more frequently. There are, in fact, 2, possibly 3 species. The taxonomy is still in a little bit of flux. The main one that seems to be the pest species is Ludwigia grandiflora, which has larger flowers and sepals, and at the base of the leaf stalk, there's a little, not only a very small stipule. It's only a sort of millimeter or so in size, and there's a difference in shape. The grandiflora has triangular stipules, whereas Ludwigia peploides has rounded stipules. Although the correct terminology is to put them in Ludwigia, they're sometimes sold in garden centres under a different name called Jasea. So do keep an eye out and try and discourage if you see it in the garden centre, try and discourage them from selling it, because it could become a potential serious pest. Also, just worth mentioning here is it's more of a sort of a wetland plant that sort of happily grows in the water, is the Hampshire purslane, Ludwigia palustris. Now, despite the being in the same family, it has opposite leaves, whereas the yellow flowering ones have alternate leaves, and the there are tiny little flowers, little greenish flowers or reddish flowers with 4 sepals. So in fact, the first time that I saw one of the yellow flowering ones, I did actually try and key it out in the book from scratch and through the family keys, and actually you'll find that you can't key out the yellow flowering Ludwigias in most of the identification books because of the different number of petals and the alternate leaves rather than opposite leaves. It's quite a rare plant in Britain. It doesn't occur in Ireland, but it does. It has appeared in a few places as an introduction, as also has a hybrid called Kentiana. But at this point anyway, it still seems to be quite a rare thing, even as an introduction. Now, so those two are the only two that have the dicot herringbone type of venation. All the remainder of this group have the parallel-sided venation, and particularly in this group are the pondweeds. And pondweeds have an obvious stem, whereas most of the others that we're coming to, all the leaves arise from the base. So there's an obvious stem with alternate leaves coming off the stem. You do get an opposite leaf just underneath the flower in Potamogetons. That is just a pair that allows it to balance the stem to send the flower out of the water. I won't go into Potamogetons in great detail, as I've covered those in one of the other webinars. But the obvious stem, also the stipule is a very characteristic thing of Potamogeton species, the pondweeds. And the two particular that you're going to come across with floating leaves are the common pondweed, which has has big stipules and a little bit under the stem, which is discolored and allows it to bend the leaf to where it fits best on the surface. Whereas in the bog pondweed, the stalk runs straight from the stalk into the leaf without that obvious kink at the top of the stalk. This is another introduction, not a common introduction, but you will find it particularly in ornamental lakes. It's called Cape pondweed or water hawthorn. It has leaves which look a bit like the common pondweed that we're just looking at, but all the leaves arise from the base. It doesn't have an obvious stem to it. And of course, the flowers are very odd looking flowers. Sort of white or sometimes a bit pinkish. But if you just have the foliage, you could easily pass over those as common pondweed. Now, most of the rest in this group are water plantains or species that are quite closely related to the water plantains. And they all go through a transitional phase. So they start off as little narrow-leaved rosettes. And as they get older, they start to produce an expanded leaf. And when those reach the surface, they just float on the water surface. So you could again possibly pass over this as a common pondweed, but again, all the leaves arise from the base. And like the common pondweed, you often have a kink where the leaf reaches the surface and it bends over and lies flat on the surface. But it doesn't have that discolored band that the common pondweed has. And there is a difference in the shape. They tend to be widest below the middle and have quite a pointed end to the leaves rather than the more even oval shape of the common pondweed. But these can fool you when, particularly sort of early in the season, when the plants are just reaching the surface. You can actually have quite a large mass of these floating leaves. But later on in the season, they will step out of the water and become the emergent plant that we're probably more familiar with the water plantains. Now there are two other water plantain relatives which I need to mention. One of these is the floating water plantain, which is quite a rare plant, extremely rare in Ireland, only in a couple of lakes in Connemara. Little bit more frequent, particularly in Wales, in Britain. And it will very often be just completely underwater and not produce any sort of flower or floating leaf. But when they do come to the surface, it produces quite a small, quite a unlike the Alisma leaves, they tend to be sort of rounded at both ends and more sort of more symmetrical oval shape. Probably the most useful character is that the plants have stolons, which the normal water plantains don't have. So if you'll see coming from the rosettes, there are these little stolons spreading out from them, each producing more little rosettes. The other one, relative of the water plantains, is a thing called starfruit, which doesn't occur in Ireland, I don't think, and is extremely rare in Britain and only in very few sites. It has very distinctive fruits, hence the name starfruit. You can see here. It's also tends to not be completely round at the base. It tends to have just a slightly cordate base. You can see it there. There's a little bit of an indentation at the base of the leaf. But it's a species that was probably never very common in Britain, but is now extremely rare and has all sorts of conservation action focused at it. So if we move on to the third group, these are the ones that have, rather than just a completely oval leaf, they have a basal incision which cuts into the leaf and up to the leaf stalk, which is usually referred to as a leaf sinus. And again, the important thing to look at in this group is the venation, and there are features of the sinus which are, whether this is sort of quite an open gap or a closed gap, which can be useful. So the first one we'll cover here is the frogbit, which is quite a small leaf, about sort of 5 centimeters or so, almost completely circular, but still with the sort of incision up to the leaf here. It has very distinct venation. I think you should be able to just sort of see that there's a vein coming out here, and it's curling right round. It never actually, it sort of bends out from the, oh sorry, that's it bends out from the leaf stalk, but never actually reaches the edge. It just curls round parallel to the edge, and eventually joins at the tip here. I think you can see it also here. So there's not much that you're going to confuse that with. That I don't think there are any other species that have that sort of pattern of venation. It is actually a free-floating plant, which has sort of dangling roots, sort of dangling underneath it, and little three-petaled flowers. It's again part of the water plantain group of species. And I suppose it's sort of trying to do the sort of monocot venation in essentially a wide dicot type shaped leaf, to fitting it into the shape of the leaf. Also, in the ones with slightly smaller leaves, we've got arrowhead. Now, arrowhead is another member of the Alisma family, water plantain family, and it has three distinct phases. You can see here these ribbon-shaped leaves. These are the underwater leaves of water plantain. So they're sort of long, strappy ribbons, and sometimes in rivers, that's all you will get. You won't get any of the later stages. But when it gets to the surface, it produces a floating leaf, quite sort of oval or quite narrow. But instead of being like, say, the common pondweed, a completely oval leaf, it has this basal gap and two lobes sticking backwards. And even at this stage, it looks quite arrow-shaped. You can see here. And then later on, it will emerge right out of the water and produce the more typical leaves that you're maybe more familiar with the arrowhead, with the more obvious sort of arrow-shaped leaves. But the venation is it tends to radiate from the point here. So you have some that are running sort of parallel up the leaf, but there are other veins that come into the lobes at the base. Another useful thing about the arrowheads is that the cross section of the leaf stalk should be triangular. Not, of course, when it's ribbon shaped like these underwater leaves, but once they start to form a proper leaf, the leaf stalk should be quite triangular in cross section. And then we have the water lilies, which are also all much bigger leaved. And there are three types, which are very easy to do when they're flowering. They got very distinctive, obviously different flowers. But they're also easy when, just from the foliage. And the thing to do is to look at the venation. So the yellow water lilies, you can see that the venation is essentially, it sort of comes out all the way up. There are veins coming out all the way up the main midrib, and they sort of spread out across the leaf, and they divide like sort of tuning forks, so sort of furcate divisions. And they divide several times, but they never actually meet at the edge. So you can see along here that there are lots of parallel veins, divisions of the veins, and they never actually meet. Contrast that with the white water lily, where most of the veins radiate out from where the leaf stalk reaches the leaf, and you can see the sort of radiate out from there. But also the branching, the veins that branch off those are much wider, and they start meeting up towards the edge of the leaf. So you end up with almost a net structure of veins around the edges of the leaf. So even if you've just got a tiny fragment washed up at the edge, you can still identify these quite easily. There is another character which is useful, which is that the stalk of the yellow water lily is triangular in cross section, whereas the white water lily has a round section. Excuse me. The third water lily, the fringe water lily, is supposed to be native in parts of England, but is quite widely planted elsewhere, and it can cause quite extensive, it can take over some lakes. It also has venation rather similar to the white water lily, the nymphea, although the venation isn't quite so easy to see. What is much more obvious is that all across the leaf there are these little dots on the underside of the leaf. You can see little sort of fuzzy dots all across the leaf, which is distinct to this species. It also tends, it's a smaller leaf typically, which instead of being a completely round edge to the leaf, if we go back to these, you can see that the leaf of the water lilies, the white water lily, is more or less completely circular, but it's a very sort of smooth edge to the leaf, both of these. Whereas this tends to have a sort of wavy edge, slightly sort of scalloped edges. So again, quite easy to identify, even if when it's not flowering. Now, there's only one yellow water lily in Ireland, but there is another not very common species that you get, particularly in Wales and Scotland, which is the least water lily, the Nuphar pumila, least yellow water lily, I should say. It's smaller in all its parts. It also has a hybrid, and sometimes the hybrid can occur on its own without one or other of the parents. Very often does. So the leaves are distinctly smaller, there are fewer veins, the flowers are smaller, but there's quite a lot of overlap, particularly between the hybrid and the least water lily. So it tends to be not very easy to make a decision about it when you just have foliage. The most useful character is the shape of the fruits. So whereas the yellow water lily has quite a fat fruit, it's sometimes called brandy bottle because it's supposed to look like a brandy flask, and it also has a slightly alcoholic smell when you break it open, which is why it has this other name called brandy bottle. But the least yellow water lily has a much narrower fruit, which looks more, in my view, looks more like a Perrier bottle. And it's quite common for it to be slightly asymmetric like this. But if you look at the stigmatic disc, whereas in the yellow water lily, it's just a complete circle. In the least water lily, there are sort of it goes in between the rays, and you can sort of see that it's got a sort of a lobed edge to the fruit. The number of these rays is also a useful character. The hybrid between the two does have a more or less circular disc. There are slight indentations, but it has more. It has sort of an intermediate number of these stigmatic rays. Now, white water lilies. The typical native white water lily has leaves and flowers which just sit on the water surface. They're sort of often quite spread across the lake surface, but there are a whole group of cultivated variants of the white water lily. Now, whereas the yellow water lily doesn't really have much in the way of cultivars, the white water lily, a French horticulturist called Marliac, around about the 1880s, managed to hybridize the native white water lily with some of the tropical varieties, and produced started to produce quite a variety of cultivars, and these have increased over the years, and there are probably 200 or 300 cultivars. Most of the cultivars are actually designed for little water bodies, ponds, tubs, and are not designed for the great outdoors. And I suspect that there are just quite a rather limited number of cultivars that you're going to come across in the wild. The things to look out for to differentiate from the native white water lily. You see the white water lily has leaves that just sit on the surface and are completely white, whereas often the cultivars have pinks or yellows, sometimes not very strongly so. This one is basically white, but there's just a slight hint of pink that you can see there. They also tend to form quite discrete patches, because they don't seem to spread. I suspect that they're not particularly fertile, and whereas the white water lily will be quite well distributed around a lake, often with the cultivars you will get a dense patch, which is often quite delimited in extent, and the foliage tends to be larger and often quite dense, so that there are leaves being pushed up above the water surface. Now, there are probably the most common creamy coloured cultivar is a thing called that grows in large lakes. Is Nymphaea Marliaceae chromatella. And it has, it's not so obvious in this picture, but it has a distinct yellowish or creamy tint to the flowers, and the leaves are quite obviously sort of streaked with purple. And that seems to be the most common variant cultivar that has the creamy flowers. The pinky flowers and white flowers are a bit more complicated. There are obviously several of these, but I suspect not many. So it's probably something that they could be quite easily tackled if you have an interest in these. And the sort of characters that that are used to separate them are the shape of the flower. The often some of them are quite sort of bowl shaped, but other ones are more sort of longer petals and look more star shaped. The amount of split, how wide the gap is between the lobes here, whether the leaves turn up at the edges is sometimes a distinctive character. You'll see also here at the base of the lobes of the leaf, there's a little sort of cusp sticking out, and that's also a character that helps to separate the different types. And there are also characters on the color on the underside of the leaf is a useful thing. Whether there are spots on the surface, like saying with the Marliaceae chromatella. There are also some that have lots of fuzzy hairs all the way up the leaf stalks and the flower stalks. So that's another character that can be useful. But for the most part, I think the aggregate term, if you're recording it, is rather than calling it Nymphaea alba, is to call it as an aggregate name, is times Marliaceae, after the Frenchman that really pioneered the variations, the cultivar variations of the white water lily. So that's where I was going to leave it for the first part. Just to say thanks to particularly to the National Parks and Wildlife Service that have done a lot to support the Aquatic Plant Project throughout the last few years. And just nicely mixed with pipewort. So that's where I was going to call a break here. And if there are any questions, welcome to have a go at answering them. Okay, Polly?
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. So we do have some questions. That's really interesting. So there's some questions just to sort of clarify things. So about Frogbit, this is from Fell. She says the description is stoloniferous, but the plant is free floating. Could you explain that, and also what the preferred habitat and the pH of the water is?
All right. Yes, I probably should have said more about the range of habitats for the species. Yeah, I apologize for that. Yeah, it is free floating. So if you look underneath, you will find a sort of little quite substantial dangling roots. But yes, it does also produce these stems which spread out over the water surface, and I suppose yes, they are like stolons. They're sort of quite fleshy stems, and produce new plants along the nodes of those stems. And it can spread as a result quite quickly across. It tends to be very much a ditch plant. So it's particularly when sort of nicer ditch systems, so not too polluted. But it can also grow in lakes, and there are and in Ireland it has appeared in a number of lakes, particularly sort of in the North Midlands and up into Northern Ireland. But there are one or two other places where it's appeared. It does seem to be spreading, and actually, because it's a free floating plant, in ditch systems, it's actually benefited from less aggressive clearance. So particularly on protected sites where people tend to be a bit more sensitive in how they clear the ditches, it's done quite well because it's a free floating plant. It quickly re-establishes after clearance. So often better than some of the submerged species.
Of course, because it's not been uprooted in the same way.
Yeah.
So next question from somebody who hasn't given their name is, are the leaves with parallel venation, are they actually monocots?
Yes, all of the ones with the parallel venation are monocots. And actually, a lot of aquatic plants are monocots. Particularly the pondweed family, Potamogeton, has a number of relatives, sort of related families, and also particularly the sort of water plantain area. Quite a lot of the species in the I don't know, is it Alisma or there may be several families involved, but they tend to be all together in the book, so they're probably quite closely related.
Yes. I have to say I hadn't realised that at all.
Yeah, well, even I think Frogbit is although it's a round leaf, I think it's part of the same three-petaled flowers. I think that Canadian pondweed is also related to the water plantains. Maybe not the same family, but they tend to be put very close to them in the books.
I think you're right. My book. So, final question before we take a short break. From Martin Godfrey, are any good ID features for Nuphar pumila?
I have struggled quite a lot. I mean, the leaves of Nuphar pumila and the hybrid are generally much smaller, and obviously smaller than the larger leaves of Lutea. But I have struggled to separate them without having flowers or fruits. Between the hybrid and Nuphar pumila. So much the best thing is to get hold of fruits or flowers. There are differences in the shape of the petals, but very often by the time bits have been washed up at the edge, the flowers have disintegrated, so you're just left with the seed head. And unfortunately, frustratingly, they're quite often growing in deep water, well but beyond the reach of wading or anything like that. So often relying on fruits being washed up at the edge can be frustrating. So probably the best tip is to get a boat out.
Okay, Nick.